The second NES Nostalgia Trip episode starts off with a game designed by Tim Stamper of Rare, previously known as Ultimate Play the Game, famous for their games for the ZX Spectrum. Snake, Rattle and Roll is, as most of the best-known games by Ultimate, an isometric 3D viewed platforming action game, although instead of having more adventurous style, this one's decidedly more arcadey. You control a snake around various types of multi-leveled environments and eat these small round creatures to gather weight, which you will eventually use at a weighing station to open the passage to the next level. Naturally, there are all sorts of hazards to avoid and enemies to kill, and there is also a time limit to each level, which makes the whole thing often a lot more hectic than necessary. However, there's also cooperative two-player mode, which more than makes up for that problem. I got introduced to this game not long after getting my very own NES around the turn of the millennium, which admittedly was a bit late, but it didn't take too long to realize what an incredibly addicting game this is, with funny graphics, great music and utterly spot-on gameplay. Although Snake, Rattle and Roll was originally made for the NES, it was also made for the Sega Mega Drive and only published in Europe in 1993, featuring one more level than the NES original. Both versions are highly recommendable, but the NES version is the one I got a firm place for my nostalgia trips. I don't particularly like sports games, so I'll include two of them into this episode so I can get rid of them as quickly as possible. Konami had a good hockey game on the NES, Blades of Steel, which I played a few times in my youth and ended up buying the cart into my personal collection from the guy who owned it in my home area back then. Blades of Steel was also released on a few other platforms, and so I wrote a comparison of it for my comparison blog. And the link for it is below in the video description if you feel like reading it. The fun thing about Blades of Steel was that it finally brought the classic ice hockey movie Slapshot into a proper video game rendition. I mentioned Slapshot for the Commodore 64 in the last C64 episode, which was nice for its time, but Blades of Steel put more emphasis on the fights and the show elements. Happily, it's also rather playable, but it's still not quite the best classic hockey game out there. It just so happens that it's the hockey game most of my generation will remember the best from all platforms, and I'd say the fighting has a lot to do with it. Is it a good nostalgia trip game then? Well, only if playing against a friend, but as I said, there are better hockey games out there, even on the NES, but this one has fist fighting. Here's one of the most obvious ones, Super Mario Bros. 3. Yeah, I skipped Mario 2 for now because I didn't actually get to play it in my youth. Although many of my NES gaming friends had Super Mario 3, I connect this game to a certain specific time and place. A couple of warm summer days at my cousin's home and we played almost the entire game through with no shortcuts, although all the basic shortcuts and other tricks were well known. An epic attempt, which I recall ended at the beginning of the 7th world, but for what reason escapes me right now. During those days, all the game's iconic graphics and sounds became etched into my brain for eternity. Being one of the most well-known and praised platforming games of all time, particularly on the 8-bits, I don't think Super Mario Bros. 3 really requires any particular description here, but at the time and for a few years on, it really was the yardstick for platforming games to measure every other by, until of course Super Mario World came along on the Super NES and basically doubled up the ante. But regardless of that, Super Mario Bros. 3 was the first proper epic, and at least to me is still one of the most replayable Mario games of all time. And lest we forget, for us here in Europe, Super Mario Bros. 3 was released in August 1991, which was right about 1.5 years after the North American release, which itself was released 1.5 years after the original Japanese release from October 1988. I think it's the perfect example of showing how late us Europeans found the NES and how little we actually cared about it back in the day. After all, by the time Mario 3 came along, the 16-bit computers had already been around for a few years, and Super Mario World had already been published for the Super Nintendo in both Japan and North America. But still, Mario 3 was the biggest thing here in late 1991 onwards until, I'd say, April 1992, and probably for a good few months henceforth. Imagine that. Another game that I connect strictly to one time and place is the rather ambiguously westernly titled Nintendo World Cup, which became known to me for being featured in a triple game cartridge, an alternative for Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt double feature. This one also had Super Mario Bros., and the second game was the Nintendo version of Tetris, which by the way is much inferior to the Tengen version. And then there was this football game which had me almost literally rolling on the floor laughing. I played this game originally in a town called Kemi, sometime between 1995 and 1997, once again during the hottest summer while visiting an uncle and listening to his ABBA vinyls. Nintendo World Cup came as a shockingly positive surprise, but I don't think I've actually played it more than twice since then, until now. It took me years to find out that this was actually a spin-off of the kunio-kun fighting games Renegade and River City Ransom by Technos Japan, which eventually explained the humor and violence. Also, what I didn't realize back then was that this game didn't have the offside rule and fouls were not punished either, probably for higher entertainment value, to go better together with the usual Neketsu style. It's definitely a blast and fairly easy game to find, and it's worth digging out every now and then if you're not too fussy about proper football rules and realistic gameplay. Now that's enough of sports for a while. The last item for today is not a single game, but a pirate card featuring about 50 games in it. They usually go by a name which is something like Super 100,001, and the one I grew up playing a lot thanks to it being in my cousin's small collection had 52 games in it, and it was originally published by Supervision. Now I'm including this here because it's part of my personal gaming tapestry as much as any other single game cartridge on these NES lists, and because most of the games included on the card aren't all that much to talk about. But there's still a whole lot more to talk about here than in the even more infamous, although definitely less of a pirate card, Action 52 by Active Enterprises from 1991, who ripped off the menu system from Supervision's pirate card. The cartridge I played back in the day, and sort of inherited since I actually bought my cousin's NES a long time ago, doesn't have the publisher name on it, and it's a Famicom card, so it requires an adapter of sorts in order to be able to insert it into an NES. Of course, the NES itself has to be modified to be able to run games from outside of Europe, but thankfully your TV set needs not to be modified. This incompatibility would, however, occasionally show up in some games by higher probability of crashing, plenty of odd characters and other artifacts on the screen, as well as occasional flashing and slowdown. I have to make it clear though that while this particular 52-in-1 is by most standards a Famicom card, it doesn't actually work on a real Famicom. Or at least I haven't been able to get it working on my Famicom. Most of the games on the cart were Famicom launch titles and other early Famicom games, which are mostly classic stuff that is mostly playable on a PAL system, but many of which were never actually released in Europe, and some even were missed in North America. It's not always easy to tell from the main menu though, since some of the game titles have been obscured or shortened, such as Legendary being The Legend of Cage, or Pipeline being Mario Bros. Or worse yet, PD Fighting being Hokuto no Ken. F1 Race, Spartan X, aka Kung Fu, and Gradius are next to unplayable, at least on a PAL system, and there are 2 hacks of Super Mario Bros. As well as a hacked version of Galaxian, in addition to the unhacked version, which takes the number of actual unique and playable games to 46, depending on how you count. My personal favorites in the cart are as follows. Adventure Island, listed as Islander in the cart menu, and is the Nintendo equivalent of Wonder Boy. The Goonies, an amazing puzzle platformer which by the way wasn't sold outside of Japan, and I also mentioned this in my comparison of the Goonies games. The Tengen version of Tetris, which is otherwise an expensive rarity and, as I already mentioned, beats the Nintendo version easily. City Connection, a side-scrolling car platformer with cats and balloons. The unforgettable Excite bike, which continues on getting better as it ages. Konami's Road Fighter, a classic top-down racer which I also wrote a comparison of a long time ago. Pinball, which by the way is one of the best 8-bit pinball games ever, with a very nice breakout-style bonus game. Ice Climber, another great two-player game that's both a competitive and a cooperative platformer. Battle City, an amazing cooperative maze shooter which MSX gamers will recognize as the sequel to Tank Battalion. Balloon Fight, a gravity-based arcade action game featuring a game mode that scrolls to the right instead of left. And Circus Charlie, a rare example of a multi-event sports game on the Nintendo without having much of an emphasis on the sports part because it's circus. Sure, there are more great games in the cart, but those are the ones I think I play the most and still do most often. An excellent piece of nostalgia, if not a very official product.